This is not rocket science. Every American instinctively knows the President of the United States can't have this unilateral authority and power.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today, I'm talking to Kettering Senior Fellow Judge J. Michael Luttig. Judge Luttig, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Brad. It's always a pleasure.
Kettering Senior Fellow Judge J. Michael Luttig is a former judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals Fourth Circuit. He served there for 14 years. Before that, he clerked for Judge Antonin Scalia, served in the Reagan White House, was Assistant Attorney General, and was on the short list for nomination to the Supreme Court. 4 months into the second Donald J. Trump administration, Judge, and you have published a piece in The Atlantic entitled "The End of Rule of Law in America." In this piece, you explore at length the ways you see Trump as having subverted the rule of law. What made you decide to write this piece? Why now?
Brad, thank you for the question. I had not written or spoken anything publicly since the election because I just didn't have anything in particular that I wanted to say. It was around mid-February, I think, when the president began issuing the executive orders targeting the nation's law firms and legal profession. So at that point, I did some soul searching because I really didn't want to come back into the public sphere yet, if at all. But I began to think about each and every one of his signature initiatives during his first 100 days. For instance, tariffs. Second, his deportations. And then his attacks on the Federal Reserve and Federal Reserve Board Chairman Jay Powell. His open assault on the 14th Amendment's citizenship guarantee, and his effort by executive order to essentially take over or commandeer federal elections here in the United States, and on down to including the executive orders that we've talked about with respect to the law firms and the nation's legal profession. So I then went in and analyzed under the Constitution and the laws of the United States and came to the conclusion that for not one single one of his signature initiatives did this president have support in the Constitution and laws of the United States.
Of all the attacks on rule of law that you outline in your piece that have resulted in, as you point out, more than 200 legal challenges that have been filed against the administration, most of which have been successful, at least preliminarily. Which of these are most important?
Any single one of them ought to be sufficient, Brad, for us to say no more, enough. But certainly any number of them in combination should be more than sufficient. And all of them together, Brad, it's unimaginable to me that the American people will not respond to this first 100 days by this president. This is not rocket science at this point for anybody. Every man and woman in the street across America can understand instinctively that what Donald Trump has done these past 100 days is wrong, whether or not they have any idea whether it's constitutional or supported by the laws of the United States. And I have never been one, as you know, to believe that the American people are supposed to know the law and the Constitution. That's why I phrased that the way I did. Every American instinctively knows that the President of the United States just can't possibly have this unilateral authority and power. And of course, he does not.
At the end of your piece, you cite Frederick Douglass. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And you're calling for the people to say no more. What acts of civic courage do you hope to see? That what might come from your fulfilling of your obligation to write this piece?
You know, I don't go into this in this article, Brad, but people ask me every day, well, what can be done? Well, the answer is that technically, under our Constitution and system of government, very, very little can be done. The first thing that could be done at some point is impeaching the president. But I say it that way because everyone knows that this Congress is never going to impeach the president, much less the Senate convict him. That may change in the midterms. I personally believe, Brad, that there'll be very little left of the America that we've known for almost 250 years by the time of the midterms in 2026. But implicit in that is what I say in the article, which is the president has already run roughshod over every institution in America, and most importantly, the other two co-equal and coordinate branches of the government, the Congress and the judiciary. So I say in the article, and I'm confident of this, that it's already clear that the Supreme Court cannot stop this president. If one assumes, as I believe, that this Congress won't, even if it could, then there is nothing at all to stop this president for the next 3.5 years other than the American people. If the American people, rise up and say no more, then at the very least, one has to assume, that would awaken the sleeping Congress from its slumber, and the Congress would begin checking the President of the United States as the Constitution contemplates that it will.
In ordinary life and in civil society, are there things that you see that are giving you any hope?
Yes, I do see the beginnings of that kind of national uprising against Donald Trump. Trump is backing off of literally everything that he's done, beginning with the tariffs. So, not that this is his goal or objective, but I don't expect hardly any of this to ever get to the Supreme Court because there will not be a ripe controversy. And if there happens to be a continuing controversy, I think that Trump would moot the case for that reason alone. He does not want the Supreme Court to decide any single one of these cases, Brad.
When you were Assistant Attorney General or when you were serving in the Reagan White House, did you ever imagine, Judge, that you would be in the Atlantic calling for a public uprising?
Donald Trump himself would probably characterize what he's doing as a revolution. And I know a lot of his followers do and have for years, Brad, because that's what's happening.
You're absolutely right, of course, that President Trump's adherents have long held to iconography and a mythos of the American Revolution. I found it remarkable the way in which in your piece you quoted the Declaration of Independence. You enumerated a bill of particulars that made this itself sound like a declaration in its own way.
Yeah, clearly and intentionally making the indisputable point that the president is revolting against all of that is and has been America. And I would hasten to add, Brad, if you could have the president sit down and ask him, are you leading a revolt against American, all of Americans' institutions? I think he would say yes, and proudly say yes, right? I mean, just think of his campaign mantra. He wants to make America great again, impliedly that it is not great any longer. Well, that's a revolution against the past. And of course, literally under our system of government and our Constitution, it's no longer available for anyone, let alone the President of the United States, to revolt against the federal government. We had one revolution in order to create this government against which it is no longer possible for an American, let alone a president, to revolt. But that's what we're witnessing and have witnessed the first 100 days of Donald Trump's presidency.
Kettering Senior Fellow, Judge J. Michael Luttig, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Brad. It's an honor to be on with you and the Kettering Foundation.
Thanks so much.